Elena Martinez pressed her face against the cold glass window of the luxury hotel, watching wealthy guests enter through golden doors. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in 2 days. At 19, she had learned to survive on the streets after her mother died and left her with nothing but debts. The December rain soaked through her thin jacket as she searched the hotel's back alley for leftover food. Her worn shoes squelched in puddles as she approached the service entrance. The kitchen staff usually threw away perfectly good meals that guests barely touched. Inside the hotel's penthouse suite, Alexander Kane loosened his silk tie and stared at the city lights below. At 32, he controlled a business empire worth billions, but tonight felt different. The chest pains had been getting worse, and his doctor's warnings echoed in his mind. His heart condition was serious, yet he couldn't slow down. Too many people depended on him. Too many deals needed his attention. Alexander's assistant had scheduled another late meeting, but he felt dizzy and exhausted. He decided to take a walk to clear his head, something he rarely did. The elevator descended to the lobby as Elena climbed over a fence near the hotel's garden area, hoping to find a quiet place to rest. The hotel's garden was usually empty at this hour. Elena found a bench hidden behind tall bushes and sat down, pulling her thin jacket tighter. She closed her eyes and tried to ignore the hunger pangs. At least here, the security guards couldn't see her. Alexander stepped into the garden through a side door, needing fresh air. The chest pain struck suddenly, sharp and overwhelming. He stumbled forward, his vision blurring as he struggled to breathe. His phone fell from his pocket as he collapsed near the fountain, gasping for air. Elena heard the sound of someone falling and quickly looked around the bushes. She saw a well-dressed man lying on the ground, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Without thinking, she ran toward him. Her grandmother had taught her basic first aid when she was young, knowledge that might save this stranger's life. She knelt beside Alexander, checking his pulse. It was weak and irregular. She had seen this before when her neighbor had a heart attack. Acting on instinct, she began chest compressions, pressing rhythmically on his chest while calling for help. But no one could hear her in the secluded garden. Alexander's eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting Elena's worried gaze. She had kind eyes, he noticed, even as his consciousness faded. Elena realized that chest compressions alone might not be enough. She remembered her grandmother's words about rescue breathing, how it could save someone's life in emergencies. Without hesitation, she tilted his head back, cleared his airway, and gave him rescue breaths. Her lips touched his as she breathed life back into his lungs. She continued the cycle of compressions and rescue breathing, determined not to let this stranger die. After what felt like hours but was only minutes, Alexander's breathing became stronger. His eyes opened fully and he looked up at the young woman who had saved his life. Elena sat back on her heels, relieved but exhausted from the effort. "Please don't speak," she said softly, noticing he was trying to talk. "You need to save your strength." "I'll get help now." She stood up to run for assistance, but Alexander managed to grab her wrist gently. He had never experienced such kindness from a stranger, especially someone who clearly had so little. Her clothes were worn and damp, but her actions had been selfless and brave. Elena looked down at him with concern. She could see he was wealthy from his expensive suit and watch, but right now he was just a human being who needed help. She had learned that money didn't matter when life was at stake. "Stay with me," Alexander whispered, still weak but determined to speak. "What's your name?" Elena hesitated. She usually avoided giving her real name to strangers, especially wealthy ones who might judge her situation. But something in his eyes made her feel safe. "Elena," she said quietly, "but you really shouldn't talk. Let me get a doctor." Before she could leave, hotel security guards appeared, drawn by the commotion. They immediately called for an ambulance and hotel management. Elena tried to step back into the shadows, not wanting to get in trouble for being on hotel property. But Alexander held onto her hand, not wanting his rescuer to disappear. He had questions that needed answers, and he wanted to thank the person who had given him a second chance at life. As the paramedics arrived and began their work, he kept his eyes on Elena. The head of security recognized Alexander immediately and began asking Elena suspicious questions about how she had ended up in the private garden. Elena's face flushed with embarrassment as she realized how her presence might look to others. "She saved my life," Alexander managed to say firmly to the security team. "She stays with me." As the paramedics prepared to transport Alexander to the hospital, He refused to let go of Elena's hand. Something had changed in those crucial moments when her breath had given him life. He didn't understand it yet, but he knew this encounter would transform everything. The ambulance rushed through the city streets with sirens wailing. Elena sat beside Alexander, still holding his hand as paramedics monitored his vital signs. She had never been inside an ambulance before, and the medical equipment made her nervous. But Alexander's grip on her hand remained firm, as if her presence was keeping him stable. "Are you family?" one paramedic asked Elena, noticing their joined hands. Alexander squeezed her hand before she could answer. "She's with me," he said weakly but clearly. Elena looked at him with surprise, unsure why he wanted her to stay when they were complete strangers. At the hospital, doctors quickly took Alexander into the emergency room. Elena tried to stay in the waiting area, but a nurse informed her that only family members could remain. She was about to leave when Alexander's assistant, James Morrison, arrived looking panicked. James had received the emergency call and rushed to the hospital. When he saw Elena sitting alone in the waiting room, her clothes still damp from the rain, he was confused. She clearly didn't belong in Alexander's usual circle of wealthy associates and business partners. "Excuse me." James approached Elena carefully. "Are you the person who helped Mr. Kane?" Elena nodded, suddenly feeling self-conscious about her appearance in the pristine hospital environment. "Is he going to be okay?" "The doctors won't tell me anything because I'm not family." James studied her face and saw genuine concern. In his 10 years working for Alexander, he had seen many people try to get close to the billionaire for personal gain. But this young woman seemed different. Her worry appeared authentic. "What exactly happened?" James asked, sitting beside her. Elena explained how she had found Alexander collapsed in the garden and performed CPR until help arrived. As she spoke, James realized that this homeless girl had quite literally saved his boss's life. Without her quick thinking and medical knowledge, Alexander might have died alone in that garden. Dr. Patricia Williams emerged from the emergency room looking serious. She had been treating Alexander for his heart condition for 2 years and had warned him repeatedly about the stress he was putting on his cardiovascular system. Mr. Kane suffered a severe cardiac episode, Dr. Williams explained to James. If someone hadn't performed CPR immediately, he wouldn't have survived. The person who helped him bought us precious time. James looked at Elena with new respect. "This is Elena. She's the one who saved him." Dr. Williams turned to Elena with interest. "You have medical training?" Elena shook her head, embarrassed. "My grandmother taught me basic first aid. She was a nurse before she retired." "Well, your grandmother's lesson saved a life tonight," Dr. Williams said warmly. "Mr. Kane is stable now, but he'll need surgery soon. His heart condition has deteriorated significantly." Elena felt relief wash over her, knowing that Alexander would recover. She stood to leave, thinking her job was done, but James stopped her. "Mr. Kane specifically asked for you to stay," James said. "He wants to thank you properly when he wakes up." Elena hesitated. She didn't feel comfortable in the expensive private hospital, surrounded by people in designer clothes and luxury cars in the parking lot. But something about Alexander's request made her curious. Hours passed as Elena waited in an uncomfortable chair. James had offered to pay for a hotel room, but she refused, not wanting charity. Instead, she accepted a cup of coffee and a sandwich from the hospital cafeteria, the first real food she had eaten in days. As dawn broke through the hospital windows, Alexander woke up in the cardiac care unit. His first thought was of the young woman who had breathed life back into his lungs. He remembered her gentle voice telling him not to speak, the concern in her dark eyes, and the way she had risked her own safety to help a stranger. "Where is she?" were his first words when James entered the room. "Elena is still here," James replied, surprised by Alexander's priority. "She's been waiting all night to make sure you're okay." Alexander felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. No one in his wealthy circles would have stayed all night in an uncomfortable waiting room just to check on his well-being. Most people in his life wanted something from him, but Elena had already given him everything by saving his life. "Bring her in," Alexander requested, though he was still weak from the medication. When Elena entered the hospital room, she was struck by how vulnerable Alexander looked, connected to all the monitoring equipment. Gone was the powerful businessman image, replaced by someone who had come very close to death. "You stayed," Alexander said softly, his voice still hoarse. Elena moved closer to his bedside but maintained some distance. I wanted to make sure you were going to be all right. The doctors told me I wouldn't have survived without your quick action, Alexander continued. You saved my life, Elena. Elena felt uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same thing. Alexander smiled weakly. No, they wouldn't have. Most people would have been too scared or wouldn't have known what to do. A nurse entered to check Alexander's vital signs, and Elena used the interruption to step back toward the door. She felt out of place in this expensive medical facility, knowing she couldn't afford even one day in a room like this. Where are you going? Alexander asked, noticing her movement toward the exit. Elena paused, unsure how to explain her situation without sounding like she was asking for help. You're safe now. That's all that matters, Alexander studied her carefully. He had built his business empire by reading people, and he could see that Elena was hiding something. Her clothes, her reluctance to accept help, her discomfort in the hospital environment all suggested she was struggling financially. James, Alexander called to his assistant. Make sure Elena has everything she needs. A proper meal, clean clothes, a place to rest. Elena's cheeks burned with embarrassment. I don't need charity. It's not charity, Alexander replied firmly. It's gratitude. You gave me my life back. The least I can do is make sure you're taken care of. The tension in the room was palpable as Elena struggled with her pride. She had been independent since her mother's death, surviving on her own without asking for help from anyone. But the genuine concern in Alexander's eyes made her defenses waver. Please, Alexander added softly, let me help you the way you helped me. Elena looked between Alexander and James, sensing that this moment would change the course of her life. She had saved a stranger's life without expecting anything in return. But now that stranger was offering her something she desperately needed, but was too proud to ask for. 3 days later, Elena found herself in a situation she had never imagined. James had arranged for her to stay in a modest hotel room, while Alexander recovered from his emergency heart surgery. The operation had been successful, but Dr. Williams insisted on a long recovery period with strict lifestyle changes. Elena stared at herself in the hotel bathroom mirror, wearing clean clothes that James had purchased for her. She felt like a different person, but the reflection still showed the same uncertain girl who had been living on the streets just days ago. The comfort felt foreign and almost guilty. At the hospital, Alexander was growing restless despite his doctor's orders to rest. His business empire needed attention, and he hated feeling helpless. But every time he tried to focus on work documents, his mind wandered to Elena. She had visited him briefly each day, always maintaining polite distance. Clearly uncomfortable with the situation. You're thinking about her again, James observed, entering Alexander's room with financial reports. Alexander didn't deny it.
She saved my life, but she won't let me properly thank her.
Every offer of help makes her uncomfortable. James sat down, having spent more time with Elena than Alexander realized. She's proud. Been taking care of herself since her mother died 2 years ago. Lost their apartment when the medical bills piled up. This information hit Alexander hard. While he had been building his fortune, Elena had been fighting just to survive. The contrast between their worlds was stark. Yet she had risked her own safety to save his life without knowing anything about his wealth or status. What does she do for work? Alexander asked. Odd jobs when she can find them. Cleaning, helping in kitchens, anything that pays daily wages. She's smart, Alexander. Reads constantly at the public library. Educates herself. Alexander made a decision that surprised even himself. I want to offer her a job. James raised an eyebrow. What kind of job? I need someone I can trust completely. Someone who isn't motivated by money or status. Someone who proved they care more about human life than personal gain. When Elena arrived for her usual brief visit that evening, Alexander was sitting up in bed looking more alert than he had since the surgery. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from the hospital's garden, a simple gesture that touched him more than expensive gifts ever had. How are you feeling? Elena asked, placing the flowers in a water glass. Better. The doctors say I can go home tomorrow, but with strict conditions. No stress, no long work hours, and someone needs to monitor my medication schedule and ensure I follow the recovery plan. Elena nodded, genuinely happy about his progress. That's wonderful news. I'm sure your family will take good care of you. Alexander's expression grew sad. I don't have family, Elena. My parents died when I was young and I never married. Work became my entire life. Elena felt a wave of sympathy. Despite his wealth, Alexander seemed as alone as she was. What about friends? Business associates mostly. People who want something from me. Alexander paused, gathering courage for what he wanted to ask. I have a proposition for you. Elena tensed, worried about what he might suggest. I need someone to help me during my recovery. Someone to make sure I take my medications, eat proper meals, don't overwork myself. A personal assistant of sorts, but more focused on health management. Elena looked at him suspiciously. You have James, and you could hire any professional nurse. James manages my business affairs, and professional nurses don't know me personally. I need someone who cares about my well-being, not my bank account. Someone I can trust. Why would you trust me? We barely know each other. Alexander met her eyes directly. Because you saved my life when you had nothing to gain from it. Because you visited me every day without wanting anything in return. Because you're the most honest person I've met in years. Elena felt conflicted. The offer would solve her immediate problems of housing and income, but accepting help still felt like charity. What would this job actually involve? Living in the guest wing of my house, making sure I follow doctor's orders, helping me maintain a healthier lifestyle. It's a legitimate job with a proper salary, health insurance, and benefits. The mention of health insurance caught Elena's attention. She had been avoiding her own medical needs for months due to cost. But the arrangement still felt too good to be true. Why not just hire a professional caregiver? She asked. Alexander struggled to put his feelings into words. Because you're the reason I'm alive. Because when I was dying, you didn't see a wealthy businessman or a potential opportunity. You saw a human being who needed help. That's the kind of person I want around during my recovery. Elena walked to the window looking out at the city lights. She thought about her life on the streets, the constant uncertainty, the hunger and cold, but she also thought about her independence and pride. This isn't charity, Alexander added, sensing her internal struggle. You'd be earning your salary. I'm not an easy patient, and changing my lifestyle won't be simple. I need someone strong enough to stand up to me when I try to cheat on doctor's orders. Despite herself, Elena smiled at this. She had seen glimpses of Alexander's stubborn nature during his hospital stay. What happens after you recover? She asked. We'll discuss it then. Maybe you'll want to pursue education, start a career. I could help with that too if you want. Elena turned back to face him. The offer was generous, perhaps too generous. But looking at Alexander's sincere expression, she saw something beyond wealth and power. She saw someone who had been as lonely as she was, someone who genuinely needed help during a vulnerable time. I have conditions, Elena said finally. Alexander's face lit up with hope. Name them. This is temporary. I'm not looking for a permanent handout. I want to earn my way. Agreed. If I think you're being dishonest about your health or trying to do too much too soon, I have full authority to intervene, even if it makes you angry. Alexander smiled, especially if it makes me angry. And I want to continue my education while I'm helping you, reading, maybe taking some online courses. I'll provide whatever resources you need for that. Elena took a deep breath, knowing this decision would change her life completely. All right, I'll help you recover. Alexander felt something lift from his chest that had nothing to do with his surgery. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to going home, knowing someone would be there who cared about his well-being rather than his business success. Neither of them realized that this arrangement would become far more complicated than either anticipated, as two people from completely different worlds began to depend on each other in ways they had never expected. Alexander's mansion overwhelmed Elena when she first arrived. The guest wing where she would stay was larger than any apartment she had ever lived in. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked manicured gardens, and the bedroom alone had more space than some people's entire homes. She felt like an intruder in this world of luxury. The first week proved challenging for both of them. Alexander was used to controlling every aspect of his life, while Elena had never been responsible for someone else's health and well-being. Their different backgrounds created constant tension as they learned to navigate their new arrangement. You need to take your medication now, Elena said firmly. Standing in the doorway of Alexander's home office where he had been working for 4 hours straight, Alexander didn't look up from his computer screen. 5 more minutes. I'm in the middle of important negotiations. Elena walked over and closed his laptop without asking permission. Dr. Williams said medication times are not negotiable. Your heart doesn't care about your negotiations. Alexander's jaw tightened with frustration. I've been running this company for over a decade. I think I can manage 5 more minutes. And I think you can manage to take your pills on time like any other patient, Elena replied, crossing her arms. This is exactly why you needed someone to monitor your recovery. Their eyes locked in a battle of wills. Alexander was accustomed to employees who never questioned his decisions, while Elena had learned to stand her ground during her difficult years of survival. Neither was willing to back down. Fine, Alexander said finally, recognizing the determination in her eyes that reminded him of the night she had saved his life. He took his medication while Elena watched, making sure he swallowed each pill properly. As days passed, they developed an unusual routine. Elena would prepare heart-healthy meals based on Dr. Williams' recommendations, often having to convince Alexander to eat vegetables instead of ordering fast food. She monitored his work hours, forcing him to take breaks and limiting his daily computer time. Alexander found himself looking forward to their interactions, even when Elena was being stubborn about his health requirements. She treated him like a regular person rather than a powerful billionaire, something he hadn't experienced in years. When she laughed at his jokes or challenged his opinions, he felt more alive than he had before the heart attack. Tell me about your life before, Alexander said one evening as Elena prepared his dinner in the spacious kitchen. Elena paused while chopping vegetables. She rarely talked about her past, but something about the quiet domestic scene made her feel safe. My mother was a teacher, Elena said softly. She raised me alone after my father left when I was 5. We didn't have much money, but she made sure I got a good education. She was diagnosed with cancer when I was 17. Alexander stopped reading his newspaper and gave her his full attention. The treatments were expensive, and insurance didn't cover everything. I dropped out of high school to work and help pay medical bills. When she died, the debt was overwhelming. I lost our apartment and ended up on the streets. I'm sorry, Alexander said, meaning it deeply. That must have been terrifying. Elena continued cooking, her voice steady but sad. The hardest part was losing hope. When you're hungry and cold every day, it becomes difficult to imagine life getting better. Alexander felt ashamed thinking about his own problems, which seemed trivial compared to Elena's struggles. How did you survive? Library during the day for warmth and to read. Shelters when I could get in, but they're often full. I learned which restaurants threw away good food and which security guards would look the other way. But you never gave up, Alexander observed. Elena smiled slightly. My mother always said that giving up was the only real failure. Everything else was just temporary setbacks. This conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Alexander began seeing Elena not as the homeless girl who had saved his life, but as a remarkably strong person who had survived incredible hardships without losing her kindness or moral compass. Elena, meanwhile, started noticing things about Alexander beyond his wealth and demanding nature. She saw how he worried about his employees during business downturns, how he donated anonymously to charities, and how loneliness had shaped his workaholic tendencies. Why didn't you ever get married? Elena asked one afternoon as she forced him to take a walk in the garden instead of attending another video conference. Alexander considered the question seriously. I always thought there would be time later. Business came first, then more business. I told myself I was building something important, but honestly I was probably scared. Scared of what? Of letting someone close enough to hurt me. Of caring more about another person than about success. Of being vulnerable. Elena understood that fear. She had built her own walls after her mother's death, trusting no one and depending only on herself. But living in Alexander's house, taking care of his health, sharing meals and conversations was slowly breaking down those barriers for both of them. Their relationship deepened when Alexander had a minor setback during his 3rd week of recovery. He experienced chest pains during the night and tried to handle it alone rather than wake Elena. She found him in the morning. Pale and weak, clearly having suffered through hours of discomfort. Why didn't you call me? Elena demanded, helping him sit up in bed while she checked his pulse and breathing. I didn't want to bother you, Alexander said weakly. Bother me? This is literally why I'm here. Elena's voice rose with genuine fear and anger. You could have died while I was sleeping 20 feet away. Seeing the terror in her eyes, Alexander realized how much his well-being had come to matter to her. This wasn't just a job anymore for Elena. She truly cared about what happened to him. Dr. Williams was called immediately, and after examining Alexander, she increased his medication dosage and emphasized the importance of reporting any symptoms immediately. "You're lucky to have someone watching out for you," Dr. Williams told Alexander privately. "Elena probably prevented another major cardiac event by getting you proper care quickly." That night, Elena insisted on sleeping in the chair beside Alexander's bed to monitor him. Despite his protests that it was unnecessary, she refused to leave his side. "Please, don't speak," Elena said softly when Alexander tried to argue, unconsciously echoing her words from the night they first met. "Just let me take care of you." Alexander fell asleep watching Elena's silhouette in the moonlight, realizing that somewhere during their weeks together, his feelings for her had evolved far beyond gratitude. The homeless girl who had saved his life was becoming the person he cared most about in the world. Elena sat awake most of the night, listening to Alexander's steady breathing and confronting her own changing emotions. Taking care of him had awakened protective instincts she didn't know she possessed, and his vulnerability had revealed a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his business persona. Both of them were beginning to understand that their arrangement was becoming something neither had anticipated, something that would complicate their already complex relationship in ways they weren't prepared to handle. 6 weeks into Alexander's recovery, their carefully constructed arrangement began falling apart. The problem wasn't Alexander's health, which was improving steadily, but rather the growing emotional connection between them that neither wanted to acknowledge. The crisis began when Victoria Sterling, Alexander's former business partner and sometime romantic interest, returned from her European vacation. She had heard about Alexander's heart attack and came immediately to his mansion, expecting to find him alone and vulnerable. Instead, she found Elena in the kitchen preparing Alexander's lunch, wearing simple clothes but moving through the expensive home with comfortable familiarity. Victoria's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose as she took in the scene. "And who might you be?" Victoria asked with barely concealed hostility. Elena looked up from the stove, immediately sensing tension. "I'm Elena. I'm helping Mr. Kane during his recovery." Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. "How interesting. Alexander never mentioned hiring a live-in nurse." Before Elena could correct the assumption, Alexander appeared in the doorway. His face showed surprise and something that might have been annoyance at seeing Victoria in his home. "Victoria, I wasn't expecting you." Victoria moved to Alexander with practiced grace, placing a possessive hand on his arm. "Darling, when I heard about your heart attack, I caught the first flight back. You should have called me immediately." Elena watched the interaction with growing discomfort. Victoria was everything Elena wasn't. Sophisticated, wealthy, beautiful in an expensive way that spoke of professional styling and designer everything. She belonged in Alexander's world in ways Elena never could. "Elena isn't a nurse," Alexander said, gently removing Victoria's hand. "She's the person who saved my life, and she's been helping me follow doctor's orders during my recovery." Victoria's eyes sharpened as she processed this information. She looked Elena up and down with new interest, clearly calculating potential threats to whatever relationship she imagined she had with Alexander. "How charitable of you, Alexander. Though I'm sure professional medical care would be more appropriate now that you're obviously feeling better." The implication was clear, and Elena felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She excused herself from the kitchen, not wanting to witness more of Victoria's territorial display. In her room, Elena stared out the window at the garden she had grown to love and faced an uncomfortable truth. She had no real place in Alexander's world. Their arrangement had been temporary from the beginning, and his recovery was nearly complete. Victoria's arrival was a sharp reminder that Elena was essentially an employee, not a permanent part of Alexander's life. Meanwhile, Alexander was having his own difficult conversation with Victoria in his office. "She's lovely, Alexander, but surely you can see how inappropriate this situation has become," Victoria said, settling into the chair across from his desk like she owned it. "Inappropriate how?" Alexander's voice carried a warning edge. "A homeless girl living in your house? People will talk. It looks like you're taking advantage of someone vulnerable." Alexander's anger flared. "Elena saved my life. She's been nothing but professional and helpful during my recovery." "I'm sure she has," Victoria replied with false sweetness. "But what happens when she decides she deserves more than just room and board?" When she realizes how much money you have and starts making demands. Elena isn't like that. Oh, Alexander. You always see the best in people. But this girl comes from a completely different world. Do you really think she can resist the temptation of everything you could offer her? Victoria's words planted seeds of doubt that Alexander tried to ignore. He knew Elena's character, had seen her integrity repeatedly over the past weeks. But Victoria's concerns echoed his own fears about the growing feelings between them. The situation became more complicated that evening when Elena served dinner. Victoria had invited herself to stay, and the tension around the dining table was thick enough to cut. Elena felt like a servant in a house where she had begun to feel at home. "Elena, dear," Victoria said sweetly, "Alexander tells me you've been taking care of him wonderfully. But surely now that he's recovered, you're eager to get back to your own life." Elena's fork paused halfway to her mouth. The question was loaded with implications, and she could feel Alexander's eyes on her face. "I'll stay as long as Mr. Kane needs assistance with his recovery," Elena replied carefully. "Of course, but he hardly needs a babysitter anymore. And I'm sure you have your own dreams and ambitions to pursue," Alexander interrupted. "Elena's help has been invaluable. The arrangement works well for both of us." But Victoria wasn't finished. "I've been thinking, Alexander. There are some wonderful programs for young people in Elena's situation, scholarships, job training programs. I could make some calls, help her get established properly." Elena set down her fork, recognizing the dismissal for what it was. Victoria was offering to help Elena leave and doing it in a way that made refusal seem selfish. "That's very kind of you," Elena said quietly, her pride warring with practicality. After dinner, Elena retreated to her room while Alexander and Victoria talked privately in his office. She could hear their voices but not their words, and she tried to ignore the jealousy that twisted in her stomach. Later that night, Alexander knocked on Elena's door. She opened it to find him standing in the hallway looking troubled and uncertain. "Are you thinking about leaving?" he asked without preamble. Elena leaned against the doorframe, suddenly exhausted by the emotional turmoil of the day. "Victoria's right about one thing. You don't need me anymore. Your health has improved significantly." "That's not what I asked." Elena met his eyes, seeing an intensity there that made her heart race. "What do you want me to say, Alexander?" "I want you to say you'll stay." "Why? Because you need a caregiver or because—" Elena trailed off, afraid to voice what she was thinking. Alexander stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being about my recovery and started being about something else entirely." Elena's breath caught. "Alexander, I know it's complicated. I know we come from different worlds. But I can't imagine going back to the way things were before you came into my life." Elena wanted to step into his arms, to forget about Victoria and social expectations and the vast gulf between their backgrounds, but Victoria's words echoed in her mind, along with her own fears about being seen as someone taking advantage of Alexander's gratitude. "Maybe Victoria's right," Elena said softly. "Maybe it would be better for both of us if I left." Alexander's face fell, but he stepped back, respecting her space. "If that's what you want." "It's not about what I want," Elena replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about what's realistic." Alexander stood in the hallway for a long time after Elena closed her door, realizing that he might lose the most important person in his life because he was too afraid to fight for her, and she was too proud to stay where she felt unwanted. The next morning, Elena woke early and began packing her few belongings. The decision to leave felt like tearing her heart out, but staying seemed impossible after Victoria's arrival and the painful conversation with Alexander. She had survived on the streets before. She could do it again until she found stable work. Alexander found her in the kitchen making his breakfast one last time. The sight of her suitcase by the door made his chest tighten with something far worse than any heart condition he had experienced. "You're really leaving," he said, his voice flat with resignation. Elena didn't turn around from the stove. "Victoria was right. You don't need me anymore, and it's time I got back to building my own life." Alexander sat heavily at the breakfast bar, watching Elena move around the kitchen with efficient familiarity. She had transformed this cold, rarely used space into something warm and welcoming during her time here. Soon it would return to being just another unused room in his empty mansion. "Where will you go?" he asked quietly. "There's a women's shelter downtown that sometimes has openings. I have some money saved from working here, enough to rent a small room until I find steady employment. The casual way she discussed returning to homelessness made Alexander realize how little he understood about her daily struggles before she had saved his life. While he worried about business deals, she had worried about basic survival. Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed immaculately despite the early hour. She surveyed the scene with satisfaction, seeing Elena's packed bag and Alexander's defeated posture. "I've made some calls," Victoria announced cheerfully. "There's a wonderful program for young women in transition. They provide job training, housing assistance, and educational opportunities. I can have Elena enrolled by this afternoon." Elena finally turned around, her face carefully neutral. "That's very generous, but I can manage on my own." "Nonsense," Victoria waved dismissively. "This program will give you proper credentials and job placement. Much better than whatever menial work you might find otherwise." Alexander watched Elena's face tighten at Victoria's condescending tone. He recognized the flash of anger in her eyes, the same fire he had seen when she fought to save his life, and when she stood up to him about his medication. "Elena doesn't need your charity, Victoria," Alexander said quietly. "It's not charity, darling. It's being practical. Elena needs proper opportunities, and you need to get back to your real life." "My real life," Alexander repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "Yes, board meetings, social events, business dinners. The world you actually belong in." Alexander looked at Elena, who was pretending to be busy cleaning the already spotless counter. Victoria's words painted a picture of his old existence, successful but empty, surrounded by people who wanted something from him but never truly cared about his well-being. "What if I don't want my old life back?" Alexander asked. Victoria laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Don't be ridiculous. You're one of the most powerful men in the city. You can't throw that away for some misguided gratitude toward a homeless girl." Elena's hand stilled on the counter. The dismissive way Victoria referred to her as a homeless girl stung. But what hurt more was waiting to hear how Alexander would respond. Alexander stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. "She's not just some homeless girl, Victoria. Her name is Elena Martinez. She's intelligent, brave, compassionate, and strong enough to survive things that would destroy most people. She saved my life and then cared enough to help me recover. She's the most genuine person I've met in years." Elena turned around, surprise and something like hope flickering in her dark eyes. Victoria's perfect composure cracked slightly. "Alexander, you're being emotional because of your health scare. You'll regret this when you think clearly." "I am thinking clearly," Alexander replied, moving closer to Elena. "For the first time in years, actually. I've spent my entire adult life building a fortune and surrounding myself with people who only care about what I can do for them. But Elena cared about me when I was dying and had nothing to offer her in return." He stopped directly in front of Elena, close enough to see the uncertainty in her eyes. "I've been afraid to admit this because I know how different our backgrounds are, and I was worried you might think I was taking advantage of the situation," Alexander continued. "But I'm falling in love with you, Elena. Not because you saved my life, but because of who you are." Elena's breath caught. "Alexander, I know you think we come from different worlds, and in some ways we do. But in the ways that matter, kindness, honesty, the ability to care about others, we're exactly the same." Victoria made a sound of disgust. "This is absurd. You've known each other for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of living together, sharing meals, talking every day, taking care of each other," Alexander said without taking his eyes off Elena. "I learned more about what matters in life during those 6 weeks than in all the years before." Elena felt tears threatening to fall. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying don't leave. Not because I need a caregiver, but because I need you. Stay and let me show you that the differences between our backgrounds don't matter as much as what we feel for each other." "And what exactly are you proposing?" Victoria demanded, her voice sharp with anger. Alexander finally looked at Victoria, his expression calm but firm. "I'm proposing that you leave my house and stay out of my personal life. Elena and I will figure out our future together, without your interference." Victoria's face flushed with rage and humiliation. "You're making a mistake, Alexander. When this little fantasy falls apart, don't come crying to me." She stormed out of the kitchen, and moments later they heard the front door slam shut. Elena and Alexander stood alone in the sudden silence, the weight of his confession hanging between them. "I should still go," Elena said softly, though her heart was pulling her in the opposite direction. "Why?" "Because Victoria was right about some things. People will judge us. They'll say I'm after your money, that you're taking advantage of someone vulnerable." Alexander reached out and gently took her hands. "Do you care what strangers think more than you care about us?" Elena looked down at their joined hands, his so much softer than hers, marked by different kinds of struggles. "I care about protecting you. Your reputation, your business. My business will survive, and my reputation means nothing if I'm alone and miserable." Elena raised her eyes to meet his. "What if it doesn't work? What if we're too different? Then we'll figure it out together. But Elena, you saved my life that night in the garden. Let me save yours now. Not with money or security, but with love." Elena felt the last of her resistance crumble. She had been afraid to hope for this kind of happiness, convinced that people like her didn't get fairy tale endings. But looking into Alexander's eyes, she saw the same love and vulnerability she felt in her own heart. "Please, don't speak," she said softly, echoing the words from the night they met. But this time, instead of stopping him from talking, she rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring all her feelings into that gentle touch. Alexander wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as if she might disappear. When they finally broke apart, Elena smiled through her tears. "I'll stay," she whispered. Alexander smiled back, feeling his heart race with joy rather than medical distress for the first time in months. "We'll face whatever comes together." 6 months later, Elena was enrolled in college courses while continuing to live with Alexander, their relationship having evolved from caregiver and patient to true partners.
She had discovered a passion for social work,
wanting to help others who faced the kind of struggles she had survived. Alexander had restructured his business to allow for better work-life balance, finding that success felt more meaningful when shared with someone who loved him for himself rather than his wealth. Their engagement announcement surprised no one who knew them well, though it certainly raised eyebrows in Alexander's former social circle. But they had learned to value the opinions of people who mattered, friends who had watched their love story unfold and recognized its genuine nature. Elena's kiss had indeed saved Alexander's life that night in the garden, but not just from his heart attack. It had saved him from a lonely existence focused only on material success, opening his heart to the kind of love he never knew he needed. And Alexander had saved Elena too, not just from homelessness and poverty, but from the belief that she wasn't worthy of love and happiness. Together, they had built something neither could have achieved alone, a partnership based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the kind of deep understanding that comes from seeing each other at their most vulnerable moments. As Elena often said when people asked about their unlikely love story, sometimes the most beautiful relationships begin with a simple act of kindness between strangers. Their kiss may have started as rescue breathing, but it had evolved into something far more precious, true love that had saved them both.